For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed, no secret is revealed, no secret is revealed.
What is the proper relationship, what should be the proper relationship between a chairman of the Fed and a president of the United States?
Well, first of all, the Federal Reserve is an independent agency, and that means basically that there is no other agency of government which can overrule actions that we take. So long as that is in place and there is no evidence that the administration or the Congress or anybody else is requesting that we do things other than what we think is the appropriate thing, then what the relationships are don't frankly matter, don't frankly matter, don't frankly matter.
What would you say to the majority of this Congress who has now co-sponsored the bill to require audits of the Federal Reserve? Do you feel that the Federal Reserve is operating with too much secrecy and too much refusal to disclose information that you have to other federal banking regulators?
We think we are quite transparent. We are happy to work with Congress if they have further concerns about any of our programs. We're more than happy to work with you to make sure that you're comfortable that they are well managed and are serving a public purpose.
Do you think it would cause problems for the Fed or for the economy if that legislation was to pass?
My concern about the legislation is that if the GAO is auditing not only the operational aspects of our programs and the details of the programs, but is making judgments about our policy decisions, that would effectively be a takeover of monetary policy by the Congress, a repudiation of the independence of the Federal Reserve, which would be highly destructive to the stability of the financial system, the dollar, and our national economic situation.
Chairman Bernanke, I'm looking at the report that you handed out this morning, and I was wondering if you could take your copy and turn to page 26.
Okay.
There's a table on page 26 which consists of your balance sheet, and one of the entries on the balance sheet is under assets, central bank liquidity swaps, which shows an increase from the end of 2007 from $24 billion to $553 billion and change at the end of 2008. What's that?
Those are swaps that were done with foreign central banks. Many foreign banks are short dollars, and so they come into our markets looking for dollars and drive up interest rates and create volatility in our markets.
So who got the money?
To financial institutions in Europe and other countries.
Which ones?
I don't know.
$500 billion and you don't know who got the money?
The loans go to the central banks, and they then put them out to their institutions to try to bring down short-term interest rates in dollar markets around the world.
Well, let's start with which central banks got the money.
There are 14 of them, which are listed I'm sure they're listed in here somewhere.
All right, so who actually made that decision to hand out $1 trillion that way, $500 billion? Who made that decision?
The Federal Open Market Committee.
Okay, and was it done at one time or in a series of meetings?
A series of meetings.
And under what legal authority?
We have a long-standing legal authority to do swaps with other central banks.
All right, we actually looked at one of the arrangements, and one of the arrangements is $9 billion for New Zealand. That works out to $3,000 for every single person who lives in New Zealand. Seriously, wouldn't it be better to extend that kind of credit to Americans rather than New Zealanders?
It's not costing Americans anything. We're getting interest back and it comes back. It's not at the cost of any American credit. We are extending credit to Americans.
Well, wouldn't it necessarily affect the credit markets if you extend $500 billion in credit to anybody?
We are lending to all U.S. Financial institutions in exactly the same way.
Well, look at the next page. The very next page has the U.S. dollar nominal exchange rate, which shows a 20% increase in the U.S. dollar nominal exchange rate at exactly the same time that you were handing out $500 billion to foreigners. Do you think that's a coincidence?
Yes.
All right, well, the Constitution says, no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law.
This money is not drawn from the Treasury.
Well, let's talk about that. Do you think it's consistent with the spirit of that provision of the Constitution for a group like the FMOC to hand out $500 billion to foreigners without any action by this Congress?
Congress approved it in the Federal Reserve Act
When was that?
quite a long time ago. I don't know the exact date.
100 years ago?
You realize it's 1914, I believe.
I don't know whether this provision was in 1914 or not, but the Federal Reserve Act was in 1913.
All right, and at that time, the entire gross national product of this country was well under $500 billion, wasn't it?
I don't know.
Is it safe to say that nobody in 1913 contemplated that your small little group of people would decide to hand out $500 billion to foreigners?
This particular authority has been used numerous times over the years.
Well, actually, according to the chart on page 28, virtually the entire amount that's reflected in your current balance sheet went out starting in the last quarter of 2007. And before that, going back to the beginning of this chart, the amount of lending was zero to foreigners. Is that
It was zero before the crisis, yeah. But this was part of the process, working with other central banks to, again, to try to get dollar money markets working normally in the global economy.
All right, my time is very limited.
The gentleman's time is expired. The gentleman
Thank
from New
you,
York.
Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Chairman. We have spent a lot of time in Congress talking about the $700 billion TARP bailout, which I voted against as it happens. Not a whole lot has been talked about with regard to the $2.2 trillion that the Fed has lent out. Now, I find that absolutely extraordinary that I wrote you a letter and I said, hey, who'd you lend the money to? What were the terms of those loans? How can my constituents in Vermont get some of that money? Who makes the decisions? You guys sit around in a room, do you make it? Are there conflicts of interest? So my question to you is, will you tell the American people to whom you lent $2.2 trillion of their dollars? Will you tell us who got that money and what the terms are of those agreements? Who got the money?
Hundreds and hundreds of banks, any bank that has access to the U.S. Federal Reserve's
Will you
discount.
tell us who they are?
No, because the reason that is counterproductive and will destroy the value of the program is that banks will not come to the discount.
Isn't that too bad?
Sorry.
In other words, isn't that too bad? They took the money, but they don't want to be public about the fact that they received it. We heard a whole lot about AIG. They're on the front pages.
These are very-
Now, I got banks and I have businesses in the state of Vermont who are in a lot of trouble. Not banks. Our banks, by the way, are doing pretty well. Now, how do these guys who are honest business people get it? Do you have to be a large, greedy, reckless financial institution to apply for these monies? Let me just say this, Mr. Chairman. I have a hard time understanding how you have put $2.2 trillion at risk without making those names available, those institutions public. And we're going to introduce legislation today, by the way, to demand that you do that. It is unacceptable to me that that goes on.
The Federal Reserve ever tried to manipulate the U.S. stock market?
No, sir. Not that I'm aware of.
Not that you're aware of, but you're the attorney, right?
That's right.
So you might not even know, right?
I would expect to know if there were something like that being done. I'm not aware of that at all.
And if you did know, you'd be bound by attorney-client privilege and you wouldn't be able to tell us, right?
Sir, if there were something the Federal Reserve were doing outside its legal authority, I would have an obligation to say something about that.
All right, so we agree that any participation by the Federal Reserve in the stock market or the futures market is outside the Federal Reserve's legal authority, right?
The Federal Reserve has some authority to regulate various aspects of markets and participate in markets in certain ways. So I think your question is too categorical, but
I think not, actually. Why don't you answer it?
I don't know, your question is so overbroad, I don't know where to begin to answer that.
I don't think it's that overbroad. I'd like you to tell me whether it's within the Federal Reserve's legal authority to try to manipulate the stock market or the futures market.
So I don't believe the Federal Reserve tries to manipulate the stock market.
Tries, come on.
No, so...
Do they?
The Federal Reserve's obligation and what it does in monetary policy is try to influence interest rates, and in that way to maximize employment and to stabilize prices.
Now, if in fact the Federal Reserve were trying to do that or doing it, isn't that something that we'd want to know?
And the extent that the Federal Reserve influences interest rates, it does make announcements of that decision immediately.
That's not what I said. I said manipulate the stock market or the futures market. Wouldn't we want to know? Yes or no?
Could you define what you mean by...
I think you know what I mean, Mr. Alvarez. Now, wouldn't it be very helpful to have a GAO audit on that subject? Wouldn't it?
I don't know what it is that you're seeking to audit, sir.
What I
it would be helpful if you could
Let's go on to something else, because the Federal Reserve actually possess all the gold that's listed on their balance sheet. Do they actually possess it?
Yes.
Has that been audited by the GAO?
I believe that's within the GAO's authority to audit. It certainly is something that our independent accountant is able to verify and does.
So if I go in and ask for GAO audit, you won't oppose it, right?
To auditing the presence of the gold on the facility? I don't see any reason to object to that.
Good.
But I do have one question. During the crisis or any time that you're aware of, has the Federal Reserve or Treasury participated in any gold swaps arrangements?
The Federal Reserve does not own any gold at all. We have not owned gold since 1934.
Now, there's been all sorts of claims of insider trading and front running by the people who execute the trades for the Federal Reserve in the market. By the way, who is that? Who actually executes the trades for the Federal Reserve in the markets?
I haven't heard of any allegations of front running.
Well, that's funny because you're the general counsel, so if anybody would know about it, you'd think you would know about it.
The Federal Reserve Bank of New York is responsible for affecting the transactions implementing monetary policy.
Okay, so then answer the question.
The Federal Reserve Bank of New York.
That's your answer?
You wanted to know who implements...
You have people sitting in screens at the Federal Reserve Bank actually executing those trades. You don't delegate that to anyone else?
No, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, of course, it's a process where there's several steps. Federal Reserve Bank of New York executes transactions through primary dealers.
Okay. Who are the primary dealers?
So the list of primary dealers is on our website.
Do you know any of them? Can you name a single one?
Sure. JPMC.
Go ahead, what?
JP Morgan Chase.
Okay, do you mind if we have a GAO audit to see whether there's been front running or insider trading by them? Do you mind? Is that okay with you?
No, I'm not sure I have any decision-making authority.
Well, you're the general counsel. I want to know if you're going to try to stop it.
GAO audits government agencies, as in you want an audit of a private entity. I think that's something that Congress would have to change the authority of the GAO to allow.
All right, now let's say, you're right, that's what we're doing right here, by the way. Let's say that the Federal Reserve gave $1 billion to a very promising fledgling institution called the Dick Cheney Savings and Loan, whose only asset is an unnumbered Swiss bank account. Don't you think it would be a good idea to have the GAO have authority to look into that? All right, now the Federal Reserve has given $1 trillion out. $1 trillion in the past 12 months. That's how much the increase in its assets and liabilities of the balance sheet has been. Who got the money? This, by the way, is a question sent to me by Beatrice Delgado. She just wants to know who got the money. Will you tell me?
So the most of the increase in our balance sheet has been the purchase of U.S. government securities and the purchase of agency guaranteed securities in the open market from market participants broadly.
And what about the rest of it?
Time has expired.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. But I really think we need answers to these questions, and the only way to get answers to these questions is to have the GAO audit the Federal Reserve. Thank you very much.
Was Treasury aware of who the counterparties were that were going to receive payment in full on the credit default swaps when $170 billion went to AIG?
They have hundreds and thousands, maybe thousands of counterparties, but I'm sure that the supervisors involved and the people at the Fed who were at the front lines of this stuff would have access to detailed information.
So they knew who was going to get the money, the counterparties.
Well, I think they could have known. Whether they knew at the time, I'm not sure they knew that, but of course they would have access to that.
Do you know if they spoke with any of the counterparties?
In what sense?
In any sense.
About what?
About the fact that
remember many of the counterparties are institutions that are supervised all the time. So I suspect
they were holding pieces of paper from an entity that was clearly insolvent. And the question of the government infusion of dollars there was going to make the difference between whether they got paid off in full or they ended up with nothing.
Right, but maybe so you finish. So where are you going? What would you like? What would you like?
I just want to know: did Treasury have conversations with any of the counterparties who ultimately profited?
I was not the Secretary of the Treasury at the time of the initial invention, but I wasn't the President of the New York Fed. And of course I was central to the basic judgment we reached together to prevent default by AIG. I'm sure that was the right judgment at the time, and you're right to point out that action did help make the system more stable, did have broad benefits to stability of the system, including the direct counterparties.
So let me then follow up. I understand your point and the distinction you're drawing. We just finished our auto report. And Chrysler and GM, insolvent company, AIG, insolvent company. Chrysler and GM have bondholders, unsecured creditors, secured creditors, and employees, and they all took big haircuts. AIG had people holding credit default swaps, and they took no haircut at all. They ended up with money from the federal government, 100 cents on the dollar, and I'm trying to understand why those two are different from each other.
But you've spent your life thinking through these things, so you understand this better than many people. And it is sort of the tragic failure about the regime we came in with, because we did not have the legal capacity to manage the orderly unwinding of a large, complex financial institution. Capacity we do have for small banks and risks, but did not have for an entity like AIG, and that forced us to do things that we would not ever want to do. But
are you saying that you couldn't find a way to pay less than 100 cents on the dollar there, but since you could find a way in the auto industry?
I mean, we would have done that in a second if we could have done that. But in deciding that default by AIG would have presented the risk of further systemic damage to a very fragile system, we made the judgment to prevent default. By preventing default, we helped AIG meet its financial obligations, not just to people that brought insurance protection, savings protection products, but to its broad counterparties. That is the consequence of that. And if you think through...
But not the same for the auto industry. Let me ask one quick question, if I can slip it in before we run out of time. And that is, a year ago, we were worried about banks that were too big to fail. But in the last year, big banks have gotten bigger, while 84 small banks have been allowed to fail, and some experts are estimating that 1,000 smaller and mid-sized banks could disappear before this crisis is over. I just want to know, are we more at risk on the question of concentration than we were a year ago?
I don't think so.
Madam Chair, in the U.S. today, the top 1% own about 38% of the financial wealth of America. The bottom 60% own 2.3%. One family, the Walton family, is worth over $140 billion. That's more wealth than the bottom 40% of the American people. In recent years, we have seen a huge increase in the number of millionaires and billionaires, while we continue to have the highest rate of childhood poverty in the industrialized world. In the last year, Charles and David Koch struggled under these policies, and their wealth increased by $12 billion in 1 year. despite the oppressive Obama economic policies. In terms of income, 95% of new income generated in this country in the last year went to the top 1%. Historically, we have considered our society to be a capitalist democracy. We may now have entered into a phase where we are an oligarchic form of society. In your judgment, given the enormous power held by the billionaire class and their political representatives, are we still a capitalist democracy, or have we gone over into an oligarchic form of society in which incredible economic and political power now rests with the billionaire class?
So all of the statistics on inequality that you've cited are ones that greatly concern me. And I think for the same reason that you're concerned about them, they can determine the ability of different groups to participate equally in a democracy and have grave effects on social stability over time. And so I don't know what to call our system or I prefer not to give labels, but there's no question that we've had a trend toward growing inequality. And I personally find it a very worrisome trend that deserves the attention of policymakers.
Thank you. I mean, I think the point that the professors are making and others have made is that there comes a point where the billionaire class has so much political power, where the Koch brothers are now, because of Citizens United, able to buy and sell politicians. They have so much political power. At what point is that reversible?
Dr. Greenspan, I want to start with you. You were the longest-serving chairman of the Federal Reserve in history, and during this period of time, you were perhaps the leading proponent of deregulation of our financial markets. Certainly, you were the most influential voice for deregulation. You have been a staunch advocate for letting markets regulate themselves. And my question for you is simple. Were you wrong?
Credit default swaps, I think, have serious problems associated with them.
Let me interrupt you because we do have a limited amount of time, but you said in your statement that you delivered, the whole intellectual edifice of modern risk management collapsed. You also said those of us who have looked to the self-interest of lending institutions to protect shareholders' equity, myself especially, are in a state of shocked disbelief, end quote. Now that sounds to me like you're saying that those who trusted the market to regulate itself, yourself included, made a serious mistake.
I made a mistake in presuming that the self-interest of organizations, specifically banks and others, were such as that they were best capable of protecting their own shareholders and the equity in the firms. The problem here is something which looked to be a very solid edifice and indeed a critical pillar to market competition and free markets did break down, and I think that, as I said, shocked me. I still do not fully understand why it happened, and obviously to the extent that I figure out where it happened and why, I will change my views. I mean, if the facts change, I will change.
You had an ideology. You had a belief that that free, competitive, and this is your statement, I do have an ideology. My judgment is that free, competitive markets are by far the unrivaled way to organize economies. We've tried regulation, none meaningfully worked. That was your quote. You had the authority to prevent irresponsible lending practices that led to the subprime mortgage crisis. You were advised to do so by many others. And now our whole economy is paying its price. Do you feel that your ideology pushed you to make decisions that you wish you had not made?
Well, remember that what an ideology is a conceptual framework with the way people deal with reality. Everyone has one. You have to exist, you need an ideology. The question is whether it is accurate or not. And what I'm saying to you is, yes, I found a flaw. I don't know how significant or permanent it is, but I've been very distressed by that fact. But if I may I just finish in answer to the question previously?
You found a flaw in the reality.
Flaw in the model that I perceive is the critical functioning structure that defines how the world works, so to speak.
In other words, you found that your view of the world, your ideology was not right. It was not working.
Precisely.
The infinite growth economic paradigm, founded upon fractional reserve banking, fiat currency, and compound interest, is a fraudulent, self-defeating, self-destructive, murderous, and suicidal game. It should be apparent to all of us by now. Until you change the way money works, you change nothing. Nothing. Anything else is suicidal. Anything else is cowardly. The paradigm trap is that half measures avail us nothing. Half measures do not avail 50% results. Half measures only make things worse. You immediately have to get rid of fractional reserve banking, fiat currency, and compound interest universally. That's the beginning. That's the start. Because until we kill this beast, nothing else can be done.